The text message glowed on my phone screen like a neon sign announcing the end of my marriage. Spend the house money on mom's kitchen. She needed it more than we need a house right now. You'll understand when you're a real mother someday. I stared at those words while sitting in my divorce lawyer's office, the papers already signed and notarized in front of me. Michelle looked up from her desk with raised eyebrows. "Well, that was faster than we anticipated," she said, sliding the documents into a manila envelope. I had been preparing for this exact moment for 6 months, watching my husband David dance to his mother's tune like a marionette. The only surprise was how predictable he actually was. I picked up my pen and calmly responded to his text with just 2 words. "I know." Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just 1 click for you, but it means a lot to me. Let me take you back 8 years to where this whole mess started. I was Sarah Coleman, 26 years old, and on the fast track to partnership at Morrison Financial Advisory. I had everything mapped out. Senior advisor by 30, my own client portfolio worth millions, maybe even opening my own firm by 35. Then I met David Richardson at a networking event, and he swept me off my feet with his charm and his grand plans to revolutionize sustainable packaging. He was passionate, articulate, and came from the kind of old money family that made my middle-class upbringing feel quaint. David had this way of making his dreams sound inevitable, like success was just waiting around the corner if only he had the right support system. When he asked me to step back from the partnership track to help him build his empire, it felt romantic. I convinced myself I was investing in our future together. What I didn't realize was that I was actually signing up to bankroll a 30-year-old man's inability to cut the apron strings. Patricia Richardson was David's mother, but she might as well have been his puppeteer. A 62-year-old woman who had never worked a day in her life, but somehow considered herself an expert on everything from business strategy to interior design. She had this talent for creating emergencies that required immediate financial attention, always perfectly timed to derail whatever progress David and I were making toward independence. At first, I thought it was sweet how devoted he was to his family. I even admired how he dropped everything when his mother called with her latest crisis. But as the months turned into years, I started recognizing the pattern. Every time we got close to a major milestone, whether it was saving for a house or David's business actually turning a profit, Patricia would swoop in with some urgent need that required David's immediate attention and, more importantly, his money. The woman had a sixth sense for sabotage disguised as maternal love. The red flags started small, which is probably why I missed them initially. About 18 months into our relationship, Patricia decided she absolutely had to take a Mediterranean cruise for her 60th birthday. Not just any cruise, mind you, but a luxury liner with a private balcony suite that cost $12,000. David didn't have that kind of money, but he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing his mother. So he asked me for a loan, promising to pay me back within 3 months. I was still in the honeymoon phase, so I transferred the money without much thought. 3 months came and went. When I gently brought up repayment, David looked genuinely confused, as if he'd forgotten the money was borrowed rather than gifted. That should have been my first clue, but I convinced myself it was just poor communication. The real wake-up call came 2 years later when David frantically called me at work, saying his mother was having a medical emergency and needed immediate surgery. He'd already drained our emergency fund, all $4,000, to cover her hospital deposit. I rushed to the hospital, terrified something serious had happened to Patricia. Imagine my surprise when I discovered her life-threatening emergency was a tummy tuck combined with a breast lift. When I pulled David aside and asked why he'd lied about the nature of the surgery, he actually had the audacity to tell me I was being unsupportive and that his mother's self-esteem was just as important as any physical ailment. That night, I started a spreadsheet. Nothing dramatic, just a simple document tracking every time money flowed from our accounts to Patricia's various needs and wants. I also began keeping copies of texts and emails, initially just to help me remember conversations, but gradually as a way to document the growing pattern of financial manipulation. I maintained my role as the supportive girlfriend, then fiancée, then wife, but internally I was building a case file. David never noticed my increased attention to detail because he was too busy managing his mother's latest crisis to pay attention to my growing awareness of his true priorities. Patricia Richardson was a master manipulator disguised as a doting mother. She had this way of infantilizing David that made my skin crawl. She still called him Davy and would literally cut his food when we went to family dinners, insisting he was too busy thinking about important things to manage such mundane tasks. When David would try to assert any independence, she'd deploy this wounded bird routine, sighing dramatically about how her baby boy was growing up too fast and didn't need his mother anymore. The woman was 62 years old and had somehow convinced her grown son that basic adulting tasks were beneath him. In 8 years of marriage, I don't think Patricia ever used my actual name. I was always that girl or David's little friend. When she was feeling particularly generous, I might get upgraded to the financial advisor, said with the same tone most people reserve for discussing intestinal parasites. She had this talent for undermining our relationship in ways that seemed innocent on the surface but were clearly calculated. She'd plan family events on dates she knew were important to us, then act hurt when David had to choose between his mother and his wife. She'd give David expensive gifts we couldn't afford to reciprocate, then make passive-aggressive comments about how some people didn't appreciate family traditions. But her real genius was in manufacturing financial crises that perfectly coincided with our major life decisions. When we were saving for our wedding, her air conditioning suddenly broke and needed immediate replacement. When David's business finally started showing profit, her car was mysteriously totaled in a parking lot and she absolutely had to have a luxury sedan because safety was paramount at her age. The most infuriating part was watching David fall for it every single time. I'd try to point out the patterns, suggest that maybe we could help his mother budget better or find more affordable solutions, but David would shut me down immediately. He'd accuse me of being jealous of his mother's place in his life or suggest I didn't understand family loyalty because I came from a different background. Every test Patricia devised, David failed spectacularly from my perspective, but passed with flying colors from hers. He'd drain our savings account, cancel our vacation plans, or postpone our house hunting, all while convinced he was being a good son. Patricia had successfully trained her adult son to believe that choosing his wife over his mother was a betrayal of the deepest kind. 6 months ago, David finally agreed we were ready to start house hunting. After years of his mother's financial emergencies derailing our savings goals, he was suddenly motivated to prove he could provide a real home for his wife. I suspect Patricia had made some comment about how successful men own property by their mid-30s because David's urgency seemed tied more to his ego than genuine desire for home ownership. But I wasn't about to waste this opportunity. By then, I'd spent years studying David and Patricia's dysfunction like a behavioral scientist. I knew exactly how this house hunting adventure would end, so I decided to control the variables. I opened 3 separate savings accounts that David didn't know existed. The first was our official house fund that he could see and access, which I deliberately kept at exactly $47,000. That wasn't an arbitrary number. Through careful observation, I'd calculated that $47,000 was just enough money to trigger Patricia's competitive instincts without being so much that David would hesitate to spend it on her whims. The second account contained our actual house down payment, safely tucked away in my name only. The third was what I privately called my freedom fund. Money I'd been systematically setting aside for the divorce I knew was inevitable. I played the excited wife perfectly, touring open houses every weekend and discussing mortgage rates over dinner. David loved playing the provider, talking about square footage and school districts like he was the one who'd calculated our debt to income ratio and researched property taxes. I even let him negotiate with real estate agents, watching him puff up with masculine pride while I did the actual financial analysis in my head. The whole time, I was waiting for Patricia's next move. I knew she wouldn't be able to stand the idea of David spending that much money on anyone but her, so I made sure to mention our house fund balance during family dinners, casually dropping the number into conversations about our future plans. I watched Patricia's face carefully during these discussions, noting how her smile would tighten and her compliments would sound increasingly strained. I was essentially baiting a trap, using David's own money as the lure. The beautiful irony was that David thought he was finally taking control of his financial future, when really he was just walking deeper into the web of dependency his mother had spent 34 years weaving around him. While David was busy fantasizing about mortgage applications, I was methodically building my exit strategy. I consulted with 3 different divorce lawyers before settling on Michelle Garrett, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in cases involving financial manipulation and emotional abuse. During our initial consultation, I laid out 6 years' worth of documentation, spreadsheets tracking money flow to Patricia, screenshots of David's promises to prioritize our marriage, and bank statements showing the pattern of financial sabotage. Michelle was impressed by my thoroughness and warned me that most women in similar situations had far less evidence to support their claims. I started recording conversations with David whenever the topic of his mother came up. It's perfectly legal in our state as long as one party consents, and I figured future me would appreciate having David's promises in his own voice. The recordings were devastating in their consistency. David would swear up and down that Patricia's latest crisis was absolutely the last time, that he understood my frustration, and that our marriage had to come first going forward. These heartfelt promises usually lasted about 6 weeks before the next emergency arose, but my masterstroke was the psychological warfare I waged on Patricia herself. I knew she monitored David's finances more closely than the IRS, so I made sure she knew exactly how much money we'd saved for our house. During family dinners, I'd casually mention our progress, watching her face carefully as I dropped numbers. David's been so responsible lately, I'd say with genuine sounding pride. We're up to $47,000 in the house fund. He's really proving he can build a future for us. I could practically see the gears turning in Patricia's head. $47,000 that her son was planning to spend on someone else, creating a life that didn't revolve around her needs. I knew she'd view our house purchase as the ultimate betrayal, proof that David was choosing his wife over his mother in the most concrete way possible. So I waited, documenting everything and building my legal case while playing the perfect supportive wife. I even helped David research neighborhoods and toured houses with genuine enthusiasm, knowing that every step toward independence we took was driving Patricia closer to her breaking point. I was essentially conducting a controlled experiment with my own marriage as the lab, testing exactly how far David would go to avoid disappointing his mother. 3 months before David sent me that fateful text about his mother's kitchen, I was sitting in Michelle's office, signing the initial divorce papers. The timing wasn't coincidental. I'd learned that in our state, there's a mandatory 90-day waiting period between filing and finalization, so I needed to start the legal process well before I anticipated Patricia's next major financial assault. Michelle had become more than just my lawyer. She was my strategic partner in this carefully orchestrated separation. She helped me understand exactly how to document our assets in ways that would protect me during the eventual division. We'd spent weeks cataloging everything from our joint checking account to David's supposed business assets, which turned out to be mostly worthless equipment and unpaid invoices from clients who'd never intended to pay anyway. The most crucial part was establishing a clear pattern of David's financial irresponsibility. Michelle explained that courts look favorably on spouses who can demonstrate they were the responsible party in the marriage, especially when children and future financial security are considerations. We compiled a comprehensive portfolio showing how I'd been the primary breadwinner while David chased his entrepreneurial fantasies and funded his mother's lifestyle. I made sure to document every instance where David had chosen Patricia's wants over our needs, every broken promise about financial responsibility, every time he'd dismissed my concerns as jealousy or selfishness. Michelle was particularly impressed by the recordings I'd made of David's repeated vows to change his priorities. Most judges hate to see one spouse manipulating the other financially, she explained. Your husband's pattern of deception and misplaced loyalty will work strongly in your favor. The beautiful irony was that while I was legally untangling myself from David, he thought our marriage had never been stronger. I'd been playing the supportive wife so convincingly that he actually believed I'd finally accepted his mother's place in our lives. He had no idea that every family dinner I attended, every smile I gave Patricia, every encouraging word I offered about his latest business venture was just me buying time to complete my legal preparations. Michelle advised me to maintain the status quo until the 90-day period was complete, ensuring David couldn't claim I'd been deceptive or manipulative. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that I was being accused of potential manipulation while secretly documenting an 8-year pattern of actual emotional and financial manipulation. The call came on a Thursday evening while David and I were having dinner. I was actually impressed by Patricia's timing. She'd waited until we were relaxed and discussing weekend plans before launching her latest assault. David's phone buzzed, and I watched his face shift from mild annoyance to concern to that familiar look of determined heroism that I'd learned to recognize over the years. "Mom, slow down," he said, putting the call on speaker without asking if I minded. Patricia's voice filled our dining room, trembling with what sounded like genuine distress, but which I recognized as her finest performance yet. She was crying about how humiliated she felt because the neighbors had just finished renovating their kitchen, and now hers looked absolutely ancient by comparison. She went on about how she couldn't bear to have the ladies' book club over anymore because she was embarrassed by her outdated appliances and worn countertops. The whole sob story was delivered with the perfect combination of vulnerability and wounded pride that had been manipulating David since childhood. I continued eating my pasta, watching David's face like I was observing a fascinating psychological experiment. I could see the exact moment when concern transformed into action. His jaw set in that way that meant he'd already decided to fix the problem, regardless of cost or consequence. Patricia was explaining through her tears that she'd gotten estimates and a complete kitchen renovation would cost around $50,000. But she just couldn't ask her son to sacrifice his future for her comfort. It was masterful reverse psychology. David was already reaching for his laptop before Patricia finished her speech. "Mom, don't worry about it," he said with the tone of a man riding to the rescue. "We'll figure this out. You shouldn't have to feel embarrassed in your own home." I almost admired Patricia's strategic brilliance. She'd waited until our house fund reached exactly the amount she needed, then created an emergency that played perfectly into David's savior complex while making her seem selfless and considerate. The woman understood her son's psychology better than any therapist ever could. I excused myself to use the bathroom, where I sent Michelle a quick text. "It's happening. Kitchen emergency as predicted. We'll call you tomorrow." When I returned to the table, David was already looking up contractors online, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was making a noble sacrifice for family. He had no idea he was about to hand me the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy his credibility forever. Back in Michelle's office, I stared at David's text message with something approaching admiration for his predictability. "Spend the house money on Mom's kitchen," She needed it more than we need a house right now. You'll understand when you're a real mother someday. The casual cruelty of that last line was particularly impressive, even for David. He'd managed to insult my capacity for empathy, dismiss our shared goals, and announce his financial betrayal all in one concise message. "Well," Michelle said, sliding the finalized divorce papers across her desk, "I have to admit, your timing was perfect. 90 days on the dot." She'd been handling my case long enough to appreciate the poetic justice of David's text arriving exactly when our legal waiting period expired. I typed back my response slowly, savoring each letter. "I know." 2 words that would completely upend David's understanding of his own marriage, though he wouldn't realize it until he walked into our empty apartment later that evening. What David didn't know was that I'd been systematically moving my belongings out of our place for the past month, not everything at once, which might have triggered his suspicions, but gradually. A few boxes of books here, some seasonal clothes there, personal documents and photo albums carefully relocated to my new apartment across town. The place David had never seen and didn't even know existed. I'd signed the lease under my maiden name and paid the deposit with money from my secret freedom fund. It was a beautiful 1-bedroom in a converted historic building with hardwood floors and huge windows that faced east so I could watch the sunrise every morning. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. By the time David sent his smug little text about understanding motherhood, I was already living independently in a space that represented everything I'd given up to support his dreams. My clothes hung in a closet he'd never seen, my coffee maker sat on a counter he'd never leaned against, and my spare key was hidden under a planter he'd never walked past. "So what's the plan now?" Michelle asked, watching me gather up the legal documents that would officially end my marriage. I checked my phone for the time. David would be getting home from work in about 2 hours, expecting to find his wife upset and manageable, ready to be soothed with promises about future responsibility and family priorities. Instead, he was going to walk into the reality of what 8 years of choosing his mother over his wife had actually cost him. David walked through our front door at 6:15, just like he had every weekday for the past 3 years. I heard him drop his keys in the ceramic bowl by the entrance, the same routine that had once felt comforting and now seemed like a relic from someone else's life. He called out my name with that careful, apologetic tone he used when he knew he'd done something questionable but believed it was ultimately justifiable. "Sarah, honey, I know you're probably upset about the text, but let me explain why this was the right decision." I stayed seated at our kitchen table, surrounded by neat stacks of papers that represented the end of everything we'd built together. When David rounded the corner into our living space, his practiced speech died mid-sentence. I watched his eyes take in the scene, the empty bookshelf where my novels used to live, the missing photos from our side table, the blank wall where my diploma had hung for 5 years. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice shifting from apologetic to confused. "Where are all your things?" I gestured to the chair across from me with the same calm I'd used to invite a client to discuss their portfolio. "Sit down, David. We need to talk." But he remained standing, his gaze moving frantically around our partially dismantled home. "Sarah, what is this? Are you trying to make some kind of point about the money? Because I can explain." I said sit down. This time my voice carried the authority I'd learned from years of managing difficult clients, and David finally complied, though he perched on the edge of the chair like he might need to flee at any moment. "Look, I know the timing seems bad," he began, slipping into his familiar pattern of justification. "But Mom was so upset, and it's not like we need to buy a house right this second. We're young. We have time." "David," I interrupted quietly, "when you sent me that text today, where did you think I was?" He blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "I don't know. At work? Why does that matter?" "I was sitting in my divorce lawyer's office." The words landed between us like stones dropped into still water. David's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to something approaching panic. "You're what? Sarah, that's not funny." I'm not joking. I reached for the first stack of papers and slid them across the table toward David. These are the divorce papers. I filed them 3 months ago, and as of today, they're finalized. David stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language, his hands shaking slightly as he picked them up. 3 months ago? But we were looking at houses 3 months ago. We were planning our future. No, David. You were planning our future. I was planning my exit. I moved to the second stack, a thick folder bound with a rubber band. This is a complete forensic accounting of your financial decisions over the past 6 years. Every dollar you've given your mother, every promise you've broken, every time you've chosen her comfort over our security. David's eyes darted between the documents and my face, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke or a scare tactic designed to make him promise better behavior. Sarah, you're being dramatic. Yes, I help my mother financially, but that's what good sons do. You can't seriously be divorcing me over. The third folder, I continued, ignoring his protests, contains a detailed log of your mother's manipulation tactics, dates, amounts, the suspicious timing of her emergencies, and recordings of every conversation where you promised me things would change. That got his attention. Recordings? Perfectly legal in our state. Would you like to hear the one from last Christmas where you swore the cruise money was absolutely the last time? Or perhaps the recording from February where you promised your mother's financial emergencies wouldn't interfere with our house plans? David's face had gone pale, and he was frantically flipping through the papers like he might find some loophole or mistake that would make this all disappear. This is insane, Sarah. You've been spying on me? Recording our private conversations? What kind of wife does that? The kind of wife who spent 8 years watching her husband choose his mother over her repeatedly. The kind of wife who documented everything because she knew this day would come. I leaned back in my chair watching David process the sheer scope of my preparation. The kind of wife who realized that the only way to protect herself was to build an airtight case against the man she thought she could trust. His confidence was crumbling in real time, replaced by the dawning realization that his predictable little wife had been 10 steps ahead of him for months. David's hands were still trembling as he flipped through the financial documents. But you can't just take our house money, Sarah. That's both of our savings, both of our future. Actually, David, that's where you're wrong. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen toward him. The $47,000 you spent on your mother's kitchen, that was a test account. Money I set aside specifically to see if you'd choose her over our future again. The color drained completely from David's face. What do you mean, a test account? I mean the real house fund, the actual $68,000 we've saved, is sitting safely in an account with only my name on it. It has been for 8 months. I watched him process this information, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You see, David, I learned something valuable from watching your mother manipulate you all these years. She always knew exactly how much money you had access to, and she always manufactured crises that required precisely that amount. So I decided to control the variables myself. David was frantically scrolling through his phone, checking our joint accounts. But our checking account shows exactly what I wanted it to show. I've been paying all our actual bills from my separate accounts for the past 4 months. The joint checking account has just enough money to cover your coffee habit and your mother's emergencies. The reality was hitting him now, and I could see panic replacing confusion. Sarah, this is fraud. You can't hide money from your husband. I can, and I did. Every dollar in those protected accounts came from my income, David. My salary, my freelance consulting work that you never bothered to ask about, my careful budgeting while you threw money at every sob story your mother invented. I opened another folder and spread the contents across the table. These are copies of every bill I've paid solo while you were busy being Patricia's financial white knight. Rent, utilities, groceries, insurance. I have documentation showing that, for the past 6 months, you've contributed exactly $0 to our household expenses while spending over $30,000 on your mother's various needs. David stared at the evidence of his own financial irrelevance, finally understanding that his wife had been supporting both him and his mother while he played pretend provider. The sound of a key turning in our front door made both David and me look up. Of course, Patricia had a key. She'd insisted on it years ago for emergencies, though the only emergencies that ever seemed to require her presence were the ones where David needed emotional support after disappointing his wife. "Davy?" Patricia's voice called out sweetly. "I brought some of that lavender tea you like, and I thought we could talk about the kitchen timeline." She stopped mid-sentence when she entered our living room and saw the scene before her. David slumped in his chair, surrounded by legal documents and financial records, looking like a man who'd just discovered his entire world was built on quicksand. Me sitting calmly across from him, completely composed and clearly in control of whatever was happening. "What's going on here?" Patricia asked, her voice taking on that sharp edge she used when things weren't proceeding according to her script. "Patricia," I said pleasantly, standing up to face her properly. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to David how your kitchen renovation is going to be funded by money that was never actually intended for your use." Patricia's eyes darted between David and the papers scattered across our table. She was smart enough to recognize a crisis when she saw one, but not quite smart enough to realize this particular crisis was entirely of her own making. "David, what is she talking about? You said you'd handle the money situation." "He did handle it," I interrupted smoothly. "He spent $47,000 from what he thought was our house fund, exactly as you trained him to do. The only problem is that money was a test, and he failed spectacularly." Patricia's face went through several expressions before settling on indignant anger. "How dare you manipulate my son like that? Setting traps and playing games with his generous nature. You mean the way you've been manipulating his generous nature for 34 years? I pulled out the thick folder containing my documentation of her patterns. "Would you like to see 8 years of evidence showing how you've systematically destroyed every financial goal David and I have ever set? How you've timed every crisis to coincide with our major life decisions?" Patricia drew herself up to her full height, clearly preparing to deploy her usual tactics of wounded motherhood and righteous indignation. But for the first time in her relationship with David, she was facing someone who had spent years studying her playbook and preparing countermoves for every strategy she might employ. Right on cue, there was a knock at our door. "That'll be Michelle," I said casually, walking past a stunned Patricia to let my lawyer inside. Michelle entered, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of confident smile that comes from winning cases before they even go to trial. "Good evening, everyone," Michelle said, setting her briefcase on our coffee table and opening it with practiced efficiency. "I have the final paperwork here, along with a few additional documents that should clarify the legal situation for everyone involved." David finally found his voice. "Legal situation? Sarah, you can't just divorce me without discussing it. We can work this out, go to counseling, figure out a compromise." "Actually, Mr. Richardson," Michelle interrupted smoothly, "your wife has documented a clear pattern of financial infidelity that gives her substantial grounds for divorce. Courts take a very dim view of spouses who repeatedly prioritize third parties over their marital obligations." She pulled out a thick folder and opened it on the table. "Financial infidelity?" Patricia scoffed. "That's ridiculous. David was helping his family." "Financial infidelity," Michelle continued, ignoring Patricia completely, "includes hiding expenditures, lying about financial priorities, and systematically undermining a spouse's financial security. Sarah has 8 years of documentation showing repeated incidents of all 3 behaviors." David was frantically flipping through the papers Michelle had brought. "But I never hid anything from Sarah. She knew I was helping my mother." "You told her the cruise money was a loan," Michelle said calmly. "You lied about your mother's cosmetic surgery being a medical emergency. You promised repeatedly to prioritize your marriage financially and broke those promises systematically. That's textbook financial infidelity." I watched David's face as the legal reality sank in. "Furthermore," Michelle continued, Since Sarah can demonstrate she's been the sole financial provider for your household while you've been funding your mother's lifestyle, the asset division will reflect that contribution disparity. Patricia finally spoke up, her voice shrill with panic. This is extortion! You can't punish a man for being a good son! Michelle turned to Patricia with the patient expression she probably reserved for particularly difficult, opposing counsel. Mrs. Richardson, your son is about to discover that choosing his mother's comfort over his wife's security has very real legal consequences. I'd suggest you start figuring out alternative funding for your kitchen renovation. David's desperation was almost palpable as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Sarah, please, we can fix this. I'll pay back every penny I spent on Mom's kitchen. I'll get a loan, sell some of my business equipment, whatever it takes. I reached into my evidence folder and pulled out a printed email dated 18 months ago. You said the exact same thing after the cruise incident. You promised to pay back the $12,000 within 6 months. You never paid back a single dollar. That was different, David said frantically. I was younger then, more naive about money. I've learned. Have you? I interrupted, pulling out another document. Because you said you'd learned your lesson after the fake medical emergency too. You promised me you'd never lie about your mother's needs again. Then you spent $4,000 on her cosmetic surgery and told me it was life-threatening. David's eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. Okay, fine. I've made mistakes, but I'll cut ties with my mother completely. No more financial help, no more emergencies, nothing. Our marriage is more important. Michelle made a small noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a voice recording. Would you like me to play the recording from last February, where you made that exact promise? Or the one from Christmas, where you swore the cruise was absolutely the last time you'd choose your mother's wants over our needs? Patricia was standing frozen by our kitchen island, apparently realizing that her golden boy had made these promises before and broken them repeatedly. I'll go to therapy, David continued desperately. Marriage counseling, individual therapy, whatever you want. I'll prove I can change. I handed him a business card that had been sitting in my wallet for 8 months. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, I made an appointment for you in March. You cancelled it because your mother needed help moving furniture the same day. I rescheduled twice. You cancelled both times. David stared at the worn business card like it was evidence of his own character assassination. Sarah, you're making me sound like a monster. I love you. I've always loved you more than anyone. Then why? I asked quietly. In 8 years of marriage, have you never once chosen me over your mother when it actually mattered? Patricia had been unusually quiet during David's desperate bargaining, but I could see her composure cracking as she realized her carefully constructed world was collapsing. Finally, she exploded. This is absolutely ridiculous, she shrieked, her refined facade completely abandoned. Sarah, you are the most selfish, manipulative woman I have ever encountered. You've turned my son against his own family with your petty jealousy and controlling behavior. I discreetly started a voice recording on my phone, holding it casually in my lap while Patricia continued her tirade. David has always been a generous, loving boy who cares about his family, but you couldn't stand that he had people in his life who mattered before you came along. You've systematically tried to isolate him from the people who truly love him. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Here was a woman who had spent 8 years manipulating her son's finances and sabotaging his marriage, accusing me of being manipulative and controlling. You set traps for him, Patricia continued, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. You deliberately created situations to make him look bad, recorded private conversations like some kind of spy, and now you're trying to destroy his life because he dared to help his mother in her time of need. David was staring at his mother with growing horror, perhaps finally hearing how she sounded when her mask slipped completely. And this whole kitchen emergency was fake? He asked quietly. Patricia whirled on him. It wasn't fake. I really am embarrassed by my outdated kitchen. Just because she set up some elaborate test doesn't mean my feelings weren't genuine. But you timed it perfectly, David said slowly, pieces clicking into place, right when we had enough money saved for a house. That's a coincidence, Patricia snapped. You can't expect me to put my life on hold just because you two are making some grand financial plans. A good son takes care of his mother's needs regardless of timing. Michelle leaned over and whispered, Are you getting all this? I nodded, watching Patricia dig her own grave deeper with every word. She was describing herself perfectly while trying to paint me as the villain, creating the most damning evidence I could have asked for. You've poisoned him against me, Patricia concluded, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. And now you're trying to steal everything he's worked for because you can't bear to share his love with anyone else. Another knock at the door interrupted Patricia's increasingly unhinged monologue. That'll be Emma, I said, walking past the stunned faces to open the door for my sister. Emma breezed in, carrying 2 boxes of wine and wearing a smile that could have powered our entire building. Sorry I'm late, she announced cheerfully. Traffic was murder, but I brought reinforcements. She held up the wine like trophies before taking in the scene. David slumped in his chair looking like he'd been hit by a truck, Patricia red-faced and trembling with rage, and Michelle organizing legal documents with professional calm. Oh, good, Emma said with satisfaction. You're at the fun part. David looked between Emma and me with growing confusion. Emma knew about this? Emma knew about this 6 months ago, I confirmed. So did Mom and Dad, my cousin Jessica, my college roommate Kate, and about half the women in my book club. Turns out, when you tell people your husband keeps choosing his mother over his wife, they're remarkably supportive of exit strategies. Emma was already heading toward our bedroom, clearly familiar with the plan. I'm here for the final sweep, she called over her shoulder. Shoes, jewelry, and that hideous bridesmaid dress from Cousin Michelle's wedding that you insisted on keeping for sentimental reasons. You've been planning this for 6 months? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been lying to my face for 6 months? I've been protecting myself for 6 months, I corrected. There's a difference. And I wasn't lying, David. I was hoping you'd prove me wrong. Every family dinner I attended, every time I smiled at your mother's latest crisis, every time I encouraged your business dreams, I was giving you opportunities to choose our marriage over her manipulation. Emma returned with an armload of my remaining clothes. Plus, she added helpfully, we all knew about Patricia's pattern. Mom called it after the cruise incident. She said any man who'd rather disappoint his wife than his mother wasn't ready to be married. Patricia gasped like she'd been physically slapped. How dare you discuss my family with strangers? They're not strangers, I said calmly. They're my family. The people who actually support my happiness instead of undermining it. Emma raised one of the wine bottles. Should we open these now, or wait until we get back to your gorgeous new apartment? David was staring at Emma like she'd just announced aliens had landed. Your new apartment? What new apartment? I reached into my purse and pulled out a small stack of business cards, sliding them across the table toward him. Coleman Financial Consulting. I've been rebuilding my career for the past year, David. Freelance work, independent clients, the kind of partnership track position I gave up to support your dreams. David picked up one of the cards with shaking hands. But you work for Morrison Financial. You have a job. I work for myself now. I gave Morrison my notice 4 months ago. I watched his face as the implications sank in. Turns out, when you're not spending every evening listening to your husband's latest business scheme or managing his mother's financial emergencies, you have a lot of time to rebuild professional relationships. Emma was loading boxes by the door, but she paused to add, She's been making more money in 6 months of freelance work than you've brought in during 3 years of entrepreneurial adventures. Patricia made a strangled noise. This is impossible. David provides for his family. He's always been the breadwinner. Actually, I said, opening my laptop and turning the screen toward them, here's my client roster for the next 6 months. I'm booked solid through December, with a waiting list for January. Turns out financial advisors who specialize in helping women protect their assets during divorce are in high demand. David was scrolling through my website, his face growing paler with each page. You built a whole business? When? How did I not know about this? The same way you didn't know I was documenting your financial irresponsibility, or moving my belongings out, or filing for divorce. I closed the laptop gently. You weren't paying attention, David. You were too busy managing your mother's emotions to notice what your wife was actually doing. Michelle cleared her throat. For the record, Sarah's financial independence significantly strengthens her position in the divorce proceedings. She's demonstrated she doesn't need spousal support, which means the court will focus purely on asset division based on contribution to the marriage. And since she can prove she's been the primary financial contributor for months, Emma added cheerfully, while David's been playing ATM for his mommy, that division is going to be very interesting. David looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time, finally understanding that his supposedly dependent wife had not only been supporting him financially, but had built an entirely independent life while he thought she was safely under his control. David suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with enough force to make everyone in the room turn toward him. The defeated man from moments before was gone, replaced by someone trying desperately to reclaim control through anger and intimidation. You know what, Sarah? Fine. You want to play games? I'll fight this divorce every step of the way. I'll drag this out for years, make it so expensive and complicated that you'll regret ever starting this nonsense. His voice was getting louder, taking on the aggressive tone he'd probably learned from his mother when she didn't get her way. I'll contest every asset, challenge every document, claim emotional distress. By the time I'm done, you'll have spent more on lawyers than you'll ever get from our marriage. Patricia was nodding approvingly, clearly delighted to see her son finally standing up to his terrible wife. That's right, Davy. Don't let her bully you. She can't just destroy a marriage because she's jealous of your mother. I reached for my phone and opened the voice recording app, scrolling through the extensive list of files I'd accumulated over the past year. David, would you like to hear the recording from 3 weeks ago where you admitted you've never been able to say no to your mother? Or perhaps the one from last month where you told me your mother's happiness was more important than our financial security because I could always make more money. David's bluster faltered slightly, but he pressed on. Those recordings are illegal. You can't use them in court. Actually, they're perfectly legal, Michelle interjected calmly. Single-party consent state, remember? And they'll be very persuasive to a judge, especially combined with the financial records. I selected another recording and let the first few seconds play. David's own voice filled the room. I know I promised to put our marriage first, but Mom was crying, Sarah. You know I can't handle it when she cries. Maybe you just don't understand family loyalty because your parents didn't need you the way Mom needs me. David's face crumpled as he heard his own words. And here's my personal favorite, I continued, playing another clip. Look, I'll always choose my mother over anyone else. That's just who I am. If you can't accept that, maybe you're not the right wife for me. The silence that followed was deafening. David's threats had evaporated completely, replaced by the horrible realization that he'd been creating evidence against himself for years, documented in his own voice and his own words. I stood up from the table and slowly removed my wedding ring, setting it down next to the divorce papers with a soft metallic clink that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. Then I pulled out my house keys and placed them beside the ring. David, you can keep the apartment. The lease is in both our names through the end of the year, but since you'll need somewhere to live while you figure out your next steps, it's yours. David stared at the ring and keys like they were foreign objects. Sarah, you can't just leave like this. We need to talk about logistics, about dividing our things. Michelle will handle all the logistics, I interrupted gently. As for our things, I've already taken everything that matters to me. The rest is just furniture and kitchen appliances. You're welcome to them. I turned to Patricia, who was standing frozen by the kitchen island, apparently realizing that her victory had turned into a complete disaster. Patricia, congratulations! You have your son's undivided attention now. I hope you're prepared for what that actually means. Emma was holding the door open, my last few boxes already loaded in her car. The apartment rent is $2,800 a month, I continued conversationally. David's business income averages about $800 monthly when he has clients. I'm sure you two can work out the math. David's face went white as the financial reality hit him. Sarah, wait. I can't afford this place without your income. You know that. Yes, I agreed. I do know that. I've known that for years. But that's not my problem anymore. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, where Emma was waiting with a grin that could have lit up Times Square. Behind me, I could hear David's voice rising with panic. Mom, you have to help me with the rent. I can't lose the apartment too. Patricia's response was predictably sharp. Help you with rent? David, I just spent my kitchen money saving you from that manipulative woman. I can't fund your entire life. As Emma and I walked toward the elevator, the sound of David and Patricia's argument echoed down the hallway. After 8 years of being caught in the middle of their toxic dynamic, I was finally free to listen to them destroy each other without feeling obligated to fix anything. 6 months later, I was sitting on the balcony of my new condo, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink. Coleman Financial Consulting had grown beyond my wildest expectations. I now had 12 regular clients, a waiting list that stretched into the new year, and had just hired my first assistant. The woman who'd once stepped back from partnership to support someone else's dreams was now building an empire of her own. My condo was everything the apartment with David had never been. Truly mine. Every piece of furniture chosen for my taste, every photo on the wall reflecting my actual life, every room arranged exactly how I wanted it. The mortgage was in my name only, paid from money I'd earned independently, representing security that no one could take away from me. The best part, though, was Marcus. I'd met him at a networking event 3 months ago, and he was everything David had never been. Genuinely interested in my career, proud of my success, and completely independent from his family's drama. When I mentioned I was a divorced entrepreneur, his response had been, "That must have taken incredible strength and planning." No one had ever described my decision-making as strength before. Through Emma, I'd heard updates about David and Patricia's situation. They'd moved in together after David couldn't make the apartment rent, and according to mutual friends, they were driving each other insane. Patricia complained constantly about David's lack of ambition, while David resented being financially dependent on his mother. They'd created their own perfect prison, and neither had the tools to escape it. My phone buzzed with a text notification. David's name appeared on the screen, and I could see the first few words. "Sarah, I've been thinking about everything, and I realize..." I stared at the message for exactly 3 seconds, then swiped left and deleted it without reading the rest. 6 months ago, that text would have sent me into an emotional spiral, analyzing every word and wondering if I'd made the right choice. Now, it was just digital noise from a life that no longer had anything to do with mine. I set my phone aside and took another sip of my coffee, watching the sun climb higher over a city full of possibilities that belonged entirely to me.